Now we come to bipolar disorder too, and the reason why I wrote the book. Writing a book is an interesting saga, or journey, I guess you might say. And it was the first book I wrote. It took 5 publishers. At one point, I was close to Harvest House, and I made it to the last meeting, and the circulation manager killed it. I went out and bought a large caramel frappuccino at Starbucks and drank the whole thing. There were a couple of publishers that I was glad. In fact, I declined 2 of them. But the good thing about it was I finally got to the last publisher, and it was Shepherd Press. And I had written, the book was all written, pretty much. And so they assigned me a publisher who promptly left the company and started his own publishing company, but then they decided to leave me with him, that he would finish it out. And they told me they wouldn't publish it for a year, and I was an impatient sort. So I had the whole thing written, so I just sent it to them, and they read it and gasped, and decided that I would rewrite it for the 3rd or 4th time. I think it was at least the 3rd time, and I did. But it was, I had a fellow who didn't actually edit, but sat on my shoulder and read everything I wrote and said, you know, you're driving the truck in the right direction. If you keep going that way, you're going off a cliff. You know, that kind of relationship. Is a dear friend, Jay Yuntz. And I intended to write about bipolar disorder. That's why I got involved in writing it. And they told me that I had to write about depression and bipolar disorder. I couldn't just write about bipolar disorder. So I had written 13 chapters about depression and was getting ready to turn the corner and write what would be the last 2 chapters of the book, which would have been about bipolar disorder, when Jay announced that I had written enough. The book was long enough, but there wasn't anything in it about bipolar disorder. I said, no, we can't do this. You know, I came to write about bipolar disorder. Thank you. And so he said I could write 2 chapters and they'd put it in as appendices. And this is the first book I've written, and it's the first publisher. And you generally, you know, first-time writers don't get to tell the publisher what to do, I guess. So I wrote those 2 chapters, and fortunately, Paul Tripp read them and said, no, they have to be in the book. So I won that. And then other interesting things were the footnotes. If you read the book, the footnotes are at the bottom of the page, which is unusual for most books today. They usually do endnotes. But the editor, who was Sue Lutz, a dear Christian lady, she told them that you have to put the footnotes at the bottom of the page because he says things that nobody's going to believe unless there's a footnote at the bottom of the page that substantiates what he says. And so that was another thing about it. The other interesting thing is that I picked the title, which is almost unheard of for first-time publishers, and I had picked that title long before it ever got to the publisher, and they liked it, so it made it. And then they picked the cover, and I liked it, which is unusual for publishers. You know, so anyway, I like that because it reminds me of iRobot. Sonny, and that's what it looks like, Sonny and iRobot. So why did I write a book? That's a really good question. I got interested in bipolar disorder because of the surge of diagnosis that we saw in the 1980s. And I didn't get so much interested in it as Randy Patton got interested in it. And the reason why he got interested in it was because they were getting all kinds of questions coming into the office at the ACBC, what would become the ACBC, about people who would come to counseling and they would say that I have bipolar disorder and that is the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing, and they say it's a disease and I can't change. That was the question. I really didn't want to get involved with bipolar disorder, to be frank with you, because I viewed it as a controversial subject, and I figured I would make few friends and probably a lot of enemies before it was over with, before I finished. But the subject grew on me. And it was good that they made me write about depression, because having written 13 chapters about depression, I think I can tell you what caused the explosion of bipolar disorder in the 1980s. And it wasn't that there were more people who actually had bipolar disorder. There were more people being diagnosed with depression and treated with antidepressants that had side effects which looked a lot like what you would call the criteria for bipolar disorder 2. I remember the first patient I saw with bipolar disorder. He was a salesman and I was a medical student. And it was one of those kind of situations where they brought him in to talk to the staff person so that we could see what someone talked like and acted like who had bipolar disorder. And this guy, he was really kind of funny to listen to and interesting. He talked 100 miles an hour. I said he talked like a person who was afraid that if he took a breath, you wouldn't let him finish his sentence. You know, it was like he was talking fast enough that you weren't going to be able to get a word in edgewise because he needed to get to the end. And he was convinced that he had brilliant ideas about business. And if he could just get out of the hospital, where I guess he was being held for his own protection, if he could just get out of the hospital, he would be able to make $1 million before breakfast, you know, that kind of thing. He certainly had the absolute fix on the next great investment. And, you know, we dutifully listened to him, noted what he was saying, and then that was the end of the interview. We saw him again about 2 weeks later, and he was a completely different person. At that point in time, he'd been on lithium carbonate for a couple of weeks, and he wasn't talking fast any longer. He wasn't talking about big business deals any longer, and if we brought it up, he was somewhat sheepish and embarrassed by it. And honestly, as we watched him in his kind of slower state, most of us thought that if we'd seen the disease, if this was the cure, we didn't know whether we thought the cure was better than the disease. You know, it's like he looked like he was a lot more fun when he was manic than when he was medicated. And what was interesting about that was that after the second interview, the psychiatrist who was there said, "I'm pretty certain most of you thought that he really didn't look as good, you know, in the second interview than he did in the first, and you thought maybe you thought he looked better in the first interview." And he said, "What you have to understand was the way he felt about that, and that was that mania, when it's full blown and they've been up for, you know, a couple of weeks and not sleeping, and there's perhaps a little delirious. What it feels like to them is like being in a car on a busy street with people walking up and down on the sidewalks, and you're doing 100 miles an hour and you don't have steering wheel or brakes, either one." He said that's what it's like for them. It's frightful. It's frightful to be manic and know that you are somewhat out of control but not understand what's going on or what to do about it. So that was bipolar disorder in 1975. In 1980, Robert Spitzer guided the revision of the DSM to DSM-3 and changed the name of manic depression to bipolar disorder. I always say this wasn't a conspiracy. I think they thought they were doing, or that they meant well, but I don't really think it turned out as well. And the reason why they changed the name, they said, was because they wanted to distinguish bipolar manic depression from schizophrenia. Personally, I always understood what manic depression was, and I really didn't need them to change the name for me to understand it. At the same time, that they added several more categories and different shades of bipolar disorder, and I would tell you that explains why the number of diagnoses exploded. The rate when in 1975, prior to the change, was probably 1 in 1,000. And if they hadn't changed the criteria, we probably wouldn't be talking about bipolar disorder in a biblical counseling setting, because manic depression is very infrequent. After the change in the criteria, which added bipolar disorder 2, it went to it depends on whose numbers you look at. It could be as high as 5 to 8% of the population at a given time. So the changing criteria is the reason. The root of the problem, where does it start? The root of the problem is in the diagnosis and the treatment of depression, which is why it was very instrumental for me to write the book 4 times and and take 5 publishers to get there. Some of the research that went into the book, including the Wakefield and Horowitz, The Loss of Sadness, wasn't available until I got to the last revision. So the real problem and the real cause for the explosion of bipolar disorder, as far as I'm concerned, is the need to fix people who are struggling with normal sadness. When a patient who is sad over loss goes to the doctor, they generally expect to be fixed in the same way the A minus, A plus commercials that you see on television work. Do you know what I'm talking about? You know, they'll come on, and the first part of the commercial is in black and white, and the individuals will all look sad and struggling. And then someplace along the middle of the commercial, they'll announce, you know, the name of the medication that the commercial is promoting. And then suddenly the picture goes to color and everybody starts smiling. And you assume that everybody who has this kind of struggle, which you think you have, you know, their life goes from black and white to color just by taking the pill. I suspect a considerable number of these folks find their way to bipolar disorder 2 and other categories because of that. The big problem with bipolar disorder is that it is made on the basis of subjective criteria, just like depression. You know, depression is diagnosis based on subjective criteria, so is bipolar disorder. You know, as I look out across the crowd, I do have one observation. It looks like you all ate lunch. You know, this is always considered the most dangerous hour of public speaking because people tend to kind of drift into carbohydrate coma or whatever. I always tell folks, don't feel bad. If you fall asleep, you know, if I were an anesthesiologist, it would be a great compliment. He just talks them to sleep. And if you wish, you could stand up. I used to, and I'll know what you're doing. When I was young and I used to work in an emergency room, I did that on and off for about 25 years. I would work on Saturday night all night, and then I would go to church on Sunday morning. And the way I survived it is that I would go to the back of the room and I would stand up all the way through church, because you can't go to sleep standing up and not get hurt. It's hard to go to sleep standing up. So, you know, if you think you're going to pass out, just move around a little bit. So we have the similar subjective criteria problem with bipolar disorder as we do with depression. And of course, one element of getting a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, you have to have a diagnosis of depression. You know, if you don't have a diagnosis of depression, in most situations, you're not going to get a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So it starts in a subjective sense with a somewhat crippled criteria, and then you add another set of criteria which are just as subjective as the depression ones are. The criteria for manic depression: you have to have a period of more than 1 week of improved mood. I guess it would depend whether you considered that a disease or not. It would depend on what part of the country you lived in. So you have to have a period of improved mood. You have to have an irritable, inflated sense of self-esteem with decreased need to sleep. That means that these people, for bipolar disorder 1 or manic depression, they can stay awake for a week or 2 weeks. And keep in mind that after 3 days, if I keep you awake for 3 solid days and you don't sleep, most of you will start to hallucinate. You'll start to see and hear things that aren't there. The increased inflated sense of self-esteem. I can remember I had one lady who came to our counseling center who most certainly had bipolar mania, and the problem that she had was that she wanted to work full-time as a nurse and work nights, and she wanted to go to school full-time during the day, and she would clean her house at night when her husband was asleep, which meant she would sweep, you know, turn on the sweeper and run it while he was asleep, which made him really unhappy. And I looked at her and I said, well, one, you can't work nights. People who have bipolar disorder or manic depression need to work days, because you don't want to disconnect yourself from the daylight dark cycle. You know, it's our body's hook to the daylight dark cycle about 2 weeks after we're born. That's why babies have trouble sleeping through the night until after a couple of weeks, and then hopefully they settle into a rhythm. And if you fight against that, it causes you trouble. So I tell folks who have manic depression, you got to work days, or at the most work evenings, and so you can sleep when the sun's down. So your cortisol works like it's supposed to. And I told that lady that. I said, look, you can't work 2 jobs. I know you feel like you can and you think you can, but you shouldn't be doing it. And she looked at me with the kind of look which tells you that you know, you could understand me if you were just smarter. That was the kind of look she gave me. It reminded me of a picture I saw once in an office that was made up of these people cubicles. You know what I mean? You have little cubicles and you have a big office space, and so it's a cubicle farm. And on the wall of one of those cubicles was a picture, and the picture was out of The Sixth Sense with Bruce Willis, and he was the psychologist, you know, who doesn't know he's dead throughout the whole movie. And and it's the little boy who says, "I see dead people," you know. And so it's a picture of Bruce Willis and the little boy, but the caption underneath it is, "I see stupid people." That was what the guy who worked in the farm, or the office cubicle farm, thought of his coworkers. And that's what that lady thought of me when I told her, no, you cannot work days, nights, and stay up. The reason why she was in counseling was because her husband sent her, because he couldn't sleep at night. They spend money they don't have. You know, I had one fellow who would give $100 tips when a $10 tip would have been too much. In restaurants, he tried to lease or rent a jet to pick up his brother in Chicago to fly to an IU basketball game, and he didn't have $100 in the bank. Spending money they don't have, you know, based on the idea that he was about to make a big business deal, and that big business deal was going to pay off. They also can make disastrous sexual and moral choices. Britney Spears, you know, the number of times she's been married to, the number of people she's been married to, and the length of time that it lasts probably speaks of someone who has some struggles in the realm of manic depression. Not to put a diagnosis on her, but that's certainly what it looks like. Mania is generally followed by depression, and depression, as it is required, you have to have depression if you're going to get the diagnosis. So Tom fits the story. That's right. Tom was a 30-year-old white male who I saw in the office after he'd been in the emergency room. He came to see me in the office. He was sent there after he was seen in the emergency room. And the occasion for him being in the emergency room is he'd gotten in a fight at work. He had a decent job. He was well-liked. He was doing well. And one day he went to work and got in a fight with people, and nobody could understand what it was about. And so they carried him off to the emergency room. The emergency room talked to him for a while and decided that he was probably manic. And when they talked to him, what they found out was he had been sleeping for days, and he had been watching television, and it was during the first Iraq War, and he was convinced that he had been told by God through the television that the people down at the Walmart that he worked at were in a conspiracy, and the conspiracy was going to have something to do with attacking the nation Israel. And so he went to work to settle the hash of those who were in the conspiracy. And, you know, obviously there was no conspiracy. They got him on medicine. He could sleep. Unfortunately, the company decided they couldn't no longer employ him. So there he was in my office, out of work, but sleeping. Now, you know, you could listen to his story and say, well, you know, maybe there's some other explanation, and maybe it isn't bipolar mania, except this wasn't his first trip to the rodeo. He'd done this a couple times already. And the usual cycle of events would be that he would have a manic episode, he would end up coming into care, either at a hospital or at a doctor's office. They would put him on medicine. He would sleep, he would recover, and then he would do it again. And by the time I saw him, he'd already lost a couple of jobs as a result of having manic episodes at work. He did well as long as he took his medicine. As long as Tom took his medicine, he generally stayed out of trouble. And we tried to maintain him on the smallest dose of medicine possible. You know, at one point, I think we had him on as little as 12.5 milligrams of Seroquel, which is about a half of the smallest tablet that there is. And I had an agreement with his wife that she would keep track of him, and if she noticed that he was starting to wind up, you know, again, then we would increase his dose. We'd increase his dose till he was sleeping again. And over the time that I took care of him, we were able to keep him out of fights and out of the emergency room. He would often come to me. He was a Christian. They were a wonderful Christian couple. They had 7 kids. And he would come and he would talk to me and say, you know, I'm doing very well spiritually. I feel fine. I'd like to quit my medicine. And I would dutifully listen to him, and I knew his story. And my response to him would be, well, Tom, if you're going to quit your medicine, tell me who's going to support your wife and 7 kids when you lose your job, because that's what's happened the last 3 times you've done it. And he would listen to me carefully, and then he would say, you know, I think you're probably right. And he would continue to take his medicine. I always admired him for that. When he understood what his duty was as a husband and as a father, he did the thing that he didn't wish to do. That's bipolar disorder 1. It's very clear. I can tell you that once you've seen somebody who's in mania, you won't forget them. And they're not hard to identify. And the thing that separates them out is mania. The being up for days in a row, the rapid speech, the grandiose thinking, the unusual spending, the bad moral choices, all those things fit. And once you see it, you'll remember it. I always appeal to Hollywood characters that I think probably were. How many of you have ever seen It's a Mad, 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 Mad World? Nobody. 1, thank you. At least 2 or 3, yes. It's a really funny movie. You ought to go look up. It's a color movie from the 1960s in Netflix, and it has every major Hollywood star of the time playing different parts in it. And the one person in it was Jonathan Winters, and Jonathan Winters talks 100 miles an hour, and he, you know, it's just, it looked like, for me, he was just playing himself. You know, that's probably who Jonathan Winters is. He was probably manic depressive, and at times the reason why he was the way he was because he was manic. Another person that you can think of would be Robin Williams. You know, the guy who talked really fast, cracked funny jokes, was always fun to listen to. Sad that his life ended the way that it did, but you would look at him and you go, I really wonder how close he lived to the edge of mania. Then, all right, so how did we move from manic depression to bipolar disorder? Well, it starts with the birth of modern medicine. We're back to the 1850s with William Perkin. Probably nobody in this room, tell me, does anybody know who William Perkin was, really, without looking at the slide? No. William Perkin was an organic chemist, and in 1800, if you were, when I was in college, medicine was the place you went. And the reason why you went to medicine was because it was the pathway for young middle-class men to step up out of the middle class and into a profession that actually paid pretty well. Boom, if you got into medical school, you had punched your ticket. And it's not so much anymore. In fact, it's engineering. If you want to know where everybody's going as far as education is concerned today, everybody wants to be an engineer. And in 1850, it was organic chemistry. The cutting edge of where you might make your fortune and do well was in organic chemistry. And what they were trying to do is figure out all the things they could make out of oil. It's what can we take and make out of oil? And for William Perkin, it was to make dye to dye clothing. And his first attempt to make dye out of oil was black, which of course made him nothing. Nobody had any trouble dyeing things black. There were lots of ways to get that done. But what he was really aiming for was purple. And he made it. He figured out how to make purple dye, which he called mauveine, out of coal tar, out of oil. And the reason why that made him a millionaire at the time was because purple dye was hard to come by. And it's the reason why it was the color of king's robes. And the reason why it was so precious and difficult to come by was at the time it was made out of the slime from snails. I always smile and say it was made out of snail snot. And you had to have a lot of snails in order to get enough of them to make purple dye. And when Perkin discovered it, he could make it cheap. So, and he takes his $1 million and steps off the stage of history. And onto that stage walks Paul Ehrlich. And Paul Ehrlich used that dye to stain secretions from patients in an insane asylum, the Charité Hospital in Berlin. He was interested in knowing what was going on in the bodies of individuals who were adjudged insane. And he and his compatriots kept doing the gram stains, and pretty soon they figured out that half of the inmates at the Charité insane asylum they weren't insane. In the process, he said it should be possible to find artificial substances which are really curative for certain diseases, not merely palliatives, acting favorably on one and another symptom. Palliative means it makes you feel better, but it doesn't cure anything. Ehrlich was looking for a cure. And what he found as he was looking at the gram stains was that half of the patients in that insane asylum had an infectious disease that caused their insanity. It was spirochetes and it was tertiary syphilis. He spent the rest of his career trying to figure out how to make a medicine that would cure it, and he did. He did. It was made out of arsenic. Yeah, arsenicals. And when I started practicing medicine, I was seeing patients who had been treated with arsenicals. They were treated with arsenicals until the invention of penicillin. And when penicillin was invented, that was the end of arsenicals, because penicillin did the job just as well. But at any rate, he went through 606 different variations until he found it. And it came to be known as 606. Now, how many of you have seen I Am Legend? Yeah, the movie with Will Smith. It was the same thing. What was Will Smith doing all the time in the movie? He was testing different drugs that would cure the virus that had gone astray and turned people into zombies. Yeah, and on about the 860th try, he found it. You know, well, that was what Ehrlich did, and he was famous for what he did, and they called the medicine Salvarsan. What Ehrlich and Koch and Pasteur did was take medicine and yank it, and particularly with regard to mental health issues, and yank it out of the theoretical swamp that was in and turned it into an objective direction. In other words, now half the people in that insane asylum could be treated. Actually, the disease course could be prevented, but not only could it be prevented, it could be treated. And they didn't have to be there. They halved that population just like that. And that's what good medicine has always been about. Truth in this regard is never an enemy to the pursuit of understanding and curing disease. Now, unfortunately, someone came after Ehrlich. It was Sigmund Freud, somewhere around 1930. And he grabs mental health in the world and turns it away from pathology to the theoretical. I guess that's a good way to put it. As I said earlier, his theories all centered around a difficult upbringing, a mother that was overbearing or something like that. And under the influence of Freud, through 1950, medicine and mental health just descended back into the swamp. It became it was the kind of confusion that in 1950 you could take the same person with the same symptoms and take them to 6 different cities in the United States and get 6 different diagnoses. That was pretty much the way it was. And what happened in 1950, and I think they meant well, was an attempt to try to standardize the language when it came to making a diagnosis of things like depression and bipolar disorder. And out of that came the original DSM. The and the DSM, I'll tell you, the DSM has never been about a cause or treatment. If you read it, it tells you that we don't list the cause for any of these disorders, and we don't tell you how to treat them. That's not what the book is about. Some cynical people will say, well, the book is about have a number, and that's the number of the disease, and that's what you have to put on the bill in order to charge for it. There's a lot to that. And it also has a great deal of effect on the pharmaceutical industry. Unless a disease or a disorder is in the DSM-5 and has a number, you can't make and manufacture and sell a drug to treat people with it. It has to have a place in the ICD-10 or in the DSM-5 in order to get it through the FDA approval process. So the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders, it was published in 1950, tried to bring order. The third revision in 1980 brought us bipolar disorder with multiple different varieties. And then Prozac was launched in 1988. All those things contribute. The categories of bipolar disorder are bipolar disorder 1, the old manic depression, bipolar disorder 2, which I would say handles 95% of all the diagnoses. An interesting game that I play with people when they come to my office and tell me they have bipolar disorder is my question is which kind? And invariably, I have very few people who will tell me bipolar 1 or bipolar 2. They really mostly say that they have bipolar disorder, and there's a distinct difference between the two. So you have bipolar 1, you have the bipolar 2. There is cyclothymia, which is where you sort of warble back and forth between the two ends. Then you have a bipolar disorder caused by substance abuse or medication-induced. That probably is, I think, one of the largest sources today. Smoking marijuana every day is a great way to end up in bipolar disorder, as far as I'm concerned. Also a great way to end up in schizophrenia for young people, particularly young people, and particularly for people who use it every day. Bipolar disorder, then there's bipolar disorder due to another medical condition, and finally bipolar disorder, other specified bipolar disorder and related disease. Used to be bipolar disorder otherwise not specified. Generally speaking, what that last category is it's sort of like a space where psychiatry can put you when they can't exactly peg you with bipolar 1 or bipolar 2, but they think you have it, so they stick you down in the bottom. It's like schizoaffective disorder is for schizophrenia, the same sort of phenomena. All right. Now moving on. That's okay. The DSM-4 or 3 came with some important changes in the diagnosis of bipolar disorder, which made it a lot easier to get. And the first is that you no longer had to be in a hospital for a week in order with mania in order to get the diagnosis. Prior to the 1980 revision, to be diagnosed with manic depression or bipolar disorder 1, you had to have been admitted to a hospital. And up until then, the incidence of bipolar disorder in the United States was about 1 in 1,000. Then you had to have the presence of for bipolar disorder, the diagnosis is much less restrictive. You do have to have one or more major depressive episodes. You have to have at least one hypomanic episode. And we'll talk about the hypomanic episode in a minute, but a great way to frame it in your thinking, hypo in Greek means below, and so it is not mania, but not quite as manic, full-blown mania, but a little bit less. That's sort of what the word is intended to convey. You can't have had mania. If you've had mania, you're going to be in bipolar disorder 1, period. So you're not going to be a bipolar disorder 2 if you've had a manic episode. And symptoms can't be better accounted for by another disorder or by substance abuse. and they do have to cause you trouble. That's a good way to distinguish it. The key differences between mania and hypomania. This is the difference between bipolar disorder 1, which I consider most certainly to be a medical illness, and then bipolar disorder 2, which I am less convinced of, is that distinct period of mania, the elevated expansive mood lasting at least a week and causing significant trouble in the individual's life. Then during the period of mood disturbance, you have to have 3 of the 4 following symptoms. 1 is an inflated sense of self-esteem or grandiosity, decreased need for sleep, but for bipolar disorder 2, for hypomania, it can be 4 hours. If you're sleeping 4 hours a night, you qualify, but not the kind of person who's not sleeping at all. The individual will be more talkative than usual, feels pressure to keep talking, will have a flight of ideas or experience thoughts that are racing, will seem distractible, will be somewhat goal-directed, although they won't finish much of anything, and there'll be excessive involvement in pleasurable activities that are high risk. And it has to represent a difference. It has to represent a difference in function that people around you will see. But it can't be severe enough and not severe enough to cause a marked impairment. So the important dividing line between bipolar disorder 1 and bipolar disorder 1 is the difference between mania and hypomania. It's important to know that even in the description of bipolar disorder 2 in the DSM-5, they note that hypomanic episodes look like what happens when people take SSRI antidepressants, which, if you look at people who are depressed in the United States and they're not doing well, almost universally, they will be taking some sort of prescribed medicine. And the problem, of course, is that most people labeled with depression are taking antidepressants. And I would tell you that instead of treating a new disease, bipolar disorder 2, I think what we're doing is treating the side effects of the medication that we're using to treat an overdiagnosed old disease. That's what I'd say is going on with regard to bipolar disorder 1 and 2. So how can we help them? Well, it's the case of the struggling young mother. I remember the first case of bipolar disorder 2 I saw in the office. It was a young lady who came to see me for a cold. And in medicine, we are obligated to go, when you come and you have a cold, we just can't see you for the cold. Used to be able, you could do that. I was listening to an old doc who graduated from medical school 4 years before me at IU and then went to the Southern Indiana in Bedford and practiced medicine there for a good long time. And he wrote a book about his first 2 years, and it was fascinating. And one of the things he said was that when I started, I could see 35 or 40 patients a day. He said, but then came electronic medical records. And he said, now that we have electronic medical records, I'm lucky if I can get through 15 or maybe 20 if I work 12 hours or something or other. And the reason is because of all the things we have to document about you and all the quality measures that we're supposed to satisfy before we're done. So in the process of satisfying those quality measures and answering all those questions, I have to ask you what all the medicines you're taking. I have to inquire about your past medical history, what's going on in your life, et cetera, so on and so forth. And in the process of doing it for this young woman who just had a cold, what I saw was that she was taking a Depakote and an antidepressant. And I thought it was a kind of a strange combination of medicine. I said, do you have a seizure disorder? And she said, no. And then I said, well, why are you taking that medicine? And her response was, well, my psychiatrist gave it to me for bipolar disorder. And it was sort of like, none of this adds up. The two things that you're taking don't usually go together. And and then I went on to ask her, have you ever had mania? Have you ever been up for 2 weeks in a row? Did you spend $30,000, et cetera, so on and so forth? I didn't ask her if she'd made any disastrous social decisions. I thought it would be a bit much for someone who was just there for a cold. But anyway, And what I found out was no, she didn't qualify for a diagnosis of bipolar disorder 1. So that sort of flips her into the bipolar disorder 2 category. But then what was her life like? What about her life got her that diagnosis? And what I found out is that she was a single mother of 2 young boys, both of whom were diagnosed with ADHD and both of whom were on Adderall. And her husband had abandoned them and was not supporting them. And so she was working a full-time job, coming home to corral 2 young boys who had, their share plus another boy or 2 share of energy. And mostly she was just really very tired and really sort of hopeless. Who was going to help her? I would have looked at her and say, well, you have a fairly good reason to be unhappy. You could be sad. And the reason why you could be sad is that, well, the person who made that promise at the altar and was supposed to hang around and help you raise these kids abandoned you, and you're struggling, and you're stuck on your own. I suspect she had started out like most in her family physician's office, and he had listened to her story dutifully and placed her on an antidepressant. And after she didn't get better, he referred her off to see the psychiatrist, and then came the bipolar disorder 2 diagnosis and 2 drugs. And at the time that I saw her, I asked her, I said, well, is this helping you? And her response was, no, not really. I'm supposed to go back. They're supposed to change my medicine again. I would look at her and I would say, she certainly needed help, but the help she was getting wasn't doing her any good. What kind of help did she need? Well, I would say, first and foremost, she needed a church. Well, first and foremost, she needed a savior. She needed grace. And then she needed a church. And what would the church do? Well, the church would do what the church ought to do for single mothers who've been abandoned by their husbands. I don't know if you guys have Awana, but it's, you may have something like it. I don't know, but it's one of those midweek programs where kids come and they learn Bible verses, and you have folks who work with them. And, that would be the kind of place that 2 small boys could be around a grandfather, and that grandfather could speak into their lives. And that church could then come around that single mother and help her as she struggled to raise those kids. That's what she actually needed. She needed hope, and she needed help, none of which she was going to get from taking medicine. So, what can we say about the diagnosis of bipolar disorder 2? The solution, I think, is the same as it's always been. We need to make a better diagnosis of depression based on the most solid factual evidence we can get. It starts by recognizing that the diagnosis of bipolar disorder today is just as confused as the diagnosis of depression is. The label offers no pathologic certainty and no way to validate it. As disordered sadness and normal sadness becomes the way for us to sort out people who are struggling with grieving versus people who might have a medical issue. So the presence of mania or the absence of frank mania, I think, is the way to sort out whether this bipolar disorder that they have is something that is probably medical or something that most likely isn't, and would yield itself to counseling. Don't get me wrong, we can help the individual who has bipolar disorder 1 with biblical counseling just as much as the one with bipolar disorder 2, but understanding the difference is a big deal in helping individuals. In the absence of mania, as far as I'm concerned, the bipolar disorder 2 label has no more validity than the label of depression in the absence of disordered sadness. Let me back up here just a smidge. So the first and most important thing to deal with for individuals who are struggling with bipolar disorder 2 is to deal with normal sadness and grieving to loss. And in biblical counseling, that is a great opportunity for us to help. And for those individuals with bipolar disorder 2, and bipolar disorder 1, all the aspects of biblical counseling come to bear. Because folks who have bipolar disorder 1 and subsequently bipolar disorder 2 will have significant difficulties to deal with. And it includes dealing with sadness, sorrow over loss, anger, fear, and worry, bitterness, self-orientation, idolatry, grace, hope, confidence, repentance, faith, sanctification. All the things that you deal with any other counselee come to bear in the life of the individual who has a label of bipolar disorder. Now, we come to the really thorny question when it comes to bipolar disorder 1 is responsibility for behavior. You know, the individual who has manic depression, bipolar disorder will do things which will completely disrupt their lives and the lives of other people. You know, the person who spends $30,000 and puts people into debt, the person who commits adultery in the process of mania. And the question becomes is who's responsible for what? And I heard Ed Welch talk about this once, and I'll share what he said with you. He had a counselee, a couple who came for counseling, and the reason why they came for counseling is that they had separated, but not divorced, and they had been separated for 10 years. And they were coming to counseling in preparation for the idea that they would reunite and live as husband and wife because they were still married as such. And the reason why they had parted company 10 years earlier was because the husband had had an episode of mania and had committed adultery during that episode of mania. And that prompted them to part ways, and they lived apart for 10 years. He had evidently lived a more circumspect life during that period of time, and the wife decided that she'd rather live with him than live without him. And so they came to counseling. And they went through counseling, and Ed said that things went well, and they moved back in with each other, and he promptly had another episode of mania. But what happened this time? This time the church knew about him. You know, his small group that was around him knew what his story was. And instead of him going off on a tear by himself, he had people who went with him. You know, his small group went with him. His small group leader and his pastor attended to him and worked and lived with him through his episode of mania. And on that occasion, he did not commit adultery. You know, the church came around him and supported him through a medical issue that would resolve given time, and it did. So then the question Ed asked was this individual responsible for the sin he committed the first time when he was manic and he committed adultery? And he just asked the crowd. And right now, I'm just asking the crowd. So yes, you're going to have to respond. What do you think? What do you think they said? He committed a sin. Was it a sin? Was he responsible for it? Now you're coming to life. Yes. Okay. We have enough people saying yes. Then the next question is where did that sin come from? Came right out of his heart. Yes. And Ed's contention is that yes, the man was responsible for it. And yes, he had to confess it and seek forgiveness for it. And the bipolar disorder mania may have made it more convenient for him to commit adultery, but it was not the source of his sin. The source of his sin came out of his heart. And that's good. And the reason why it's good is because if you say that, then he can repent. You know, and then people can come around him and do what they did. They could stand with him and stand around him and support him through the next episode. So, medicine. What do I think about medicine? Well, I'm a doctor. Yes. With regard to bipolar disorder 1, again, we don't have absolute pathology for bipolar disorder 1, so I fail 1 out of my 3 things, my 3 questions. But, you practice medicine for a really long time, and you look at things, and eventually you have an opinion. And you always hate it when a doctor starts off and says, "in my opinion." I can remember listening to one researcher said that when somebody starts off with that, you should run, run for the hills. He's getting ready to give you his opinion. What they're wanting are facts with a p-value. And but I look at bipolar disorder 1, and to me, it looks like a medical problem, or a problem that has a medical source, a difference in the brain that makes them subject to this in one way or another. We haven't proved it yet. We may not prove that in my lifetime, but that's what it looks like to me. So, thinking that, what do I think of medicine? I think people who've had 2 or 3 episodes of mania probably do better taking medicine than not taking medicine. The medicine is significant, has significant side effects. Don't misunderstand me. It is a burden. Going forward, hopefully we'll have better medicine as time goes forward. We continue to make better medicine for other diseases. Things that are complicated and hard to treat. Sometimes, you'll pop up and have a better solution and cure. But even though the medicine does carry with it significant side effects, once a person's had 2 or 3 episodes of mania, the odds are they will do it again. And they need careful watching, and they probably need to take medicine. On the other hand, bipolar disorder 2, I think that the benefit of taking medicine for bipolar disorder 2 is subject to question. I don't have a strong opinion about it. I don't tell people they should quit taking medicine that other doctors have given them, but as a physician, I probably wouldn't treat somebody with atypical antipsychotics or lithium for something like bipolar disorder 2. I probably wouldn't be treating them with an antidepressant in the first place. In either case, the use of medication is not a primary issue in biblical counseling. What do you think the major goal is in biblical counseling? What do you think anybody here watch Star Trek? A couple of you. That's really good. Do you remember what the prime directive was? This is for really dedicated Trekkies. Huh? That's the mission. Exploring new worlds and going where no man has gone before. That's the mission. There you go. That's exactly right. Very good. It was non-interference. You weren't supposed to interfere in alien cultures because they thought that it was sort of like bumping somebody and they would go the wrong way and disaster would ensue because you had intervened. Of course, if you watch Star Trek very much, what did they do in every episode? Yeah, it was a Gene Roddenberry joke. That's what it was. Yes, the prime directive. What's the prime directive for believers and the prime directive for biblical counseling? Yes, very good. Yes, I want to glorify God with my life more than I want to breathe, and I want to enable counselees to do the same. It is not getting people off medicine. I always smile and say, if your main goal in doing counseling is to get people off medicine, you may have an idol of the heart problem. Yeah, because that isn't what biblical counseling is about so much. Primary goal of biblical counseling, I guess it was up on the wall, wasn't it? Oh, yes, I want to glorify God with my life more than I want to breathe. All right. The greatest benefit to those with mood disorders, I think, is found by discerning between the difference between normal and disordered sadness and then dealing with it from a biblical viewpoint. I think that's the place that we as counselors can have the most profound effect and do the most good. And that's the end of the lecture. Are you going to quit or should it? Oh. Huh? Okay. We're going to quit. I was going to offer to answer questions, but we'll quit. All right. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, God, I thank you for this time, and I thank you for your word, and I thank you for how it enables us to help individuals who struggle. God, I pray that everyone here today will have learned something that they can help others with, and then that they'll go do it. And I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen.